In the annals of World War II's darkest chapters, few figures loom as ominously as Arthur Seyss-Inquart, a man whose name became synonymous with brutality and oppression in the occupied Netherlands. Born on July 22, 1892, in Stannern, Austria-Hungary, now Stonařov, Czech Republic, Seyss-Inquart's journey from a small-town lawyer to one of the Third Reich's most notorious war criminals is a chilling testament to the corrupting influence of power and ideology. His life would come to embody the words of Lord Acton: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Seyss-Inquart's rise to infamy began in his native Austria, where he played a pivotal role in the Anschluss, the forcible annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1938. As a long-time Nazi sympathizer and member of the Austrian Nazi Party since 1931, Seyss-Inquart maneuvered himself into the position of Austrian Chancellor on March 11, 1938, just days before the Anschluss. His brief tenure as Chancellor, lasting a mere 2 days, was enough to pave the way for German troops to march into Austria unopposed. In a dramatic radio address on March 12th, he invited German forces to enter Austria to restore order, effectively surrendering Austrian sovereignty. For his treachery, he was rewarded with the position of Reich Governor of Austria, overseeing the integration of his homeland into the growing Nazi Empire. But it was in Poland where Seyss-Inquart first demonstrated the ruthlessness that would later characterize his rule in the Netherlands. Appointed Deputy Governor-General of the occupied Polish territories on October 12, 1939, he was instrumental in implementing policies of racial persecution and economic exploitation. Under his watch, Poland became a laboratory for Nazi atrocities, with mass deportations, forced labor, and the establishment of ghettos becoming commonplace. In Krakow, he oversaw the creation of the Jewish ghetto in March 1941, cramming 15,000 Jews into an area designed for 3,000. His policies in Poland set the stage for the horrors to come, with Polish historian Czesław Madaczyk later writing, "Seyss-Inquart's actions in Poland were a preview of the terror he would unleash in the Netherlands." However, it was his appointment as Reich Commissioner for the occupied Netherlands on May 18, 1940, that would cement Seyss-Inquart's place in the pantheon of Nazi war criminals. From his headquarters in The Hague, housed in the elegant Kneuterdijk Palace, he ruled the Netherlands with an iron fist, implementing a series of increasingly draconian measures aimed at crushing Dutch resistance and exploiting the country's resources for the German war machine. His arrival was marked by a chilling speech at the Ridderzaal on May 29, 1940, where he declared, "We do not come here to oppress a people and destroy its character," words that would soon prove to be a bitter irony. One of Seyss-Inquart's first acts was to dissolve the Dutch parliament and assume direct control over the country's administration. He then set about systematically dismantling Dutch society, banning political parties, censoring the press, and imposing strict rationing. On July 20, 1940, he outlawed all political parties except for the Dutch Nazi Party, led by Anton Mussert. The free press was silenced, with newspapers like De Telegraaf forced to toe the Nazi line or face closure. But it was his treatment of the Netherlands' Jewish population that would earn him the moniker Hangman of the Netherlands. Under Seyss-Inquart's rule, the persecution of Dutch Jews intensified rapidly. On February 22, 1941, the first razzia, raid, took place in Amsterdam, with 427 young Jewish men rounded up and deported to concentration camps. This marked the beginning of a campaign of terror that would see over 100,000 Dutch Jews, more than 70% of the pre-war Jewish population, deported to Nazi death camps. The brutality of these actions sparked the February strike, a rare instance of mass public protest against the treatment of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. One of the most notorious incidents occurred on May 26, 1942, when Seyss-Inquart issued a decree requiring all Jews to wear a yellow star. This was followed by mass deportations, with the first transport leaving the transit camp of Westerbork for Auschwitz on July 15, 1942. Among those deported was the young diarist Anne Frank, whose poignant account of life in hiding would later become a powerful testament to the horrors of the Holocaust. In her diary, Anne wrote of the fear that permeated Amsterdam. "Our many Jewish friends and acquaintances are being taken away in droves. We assume that most of them are being murdered. The English radio says they're being gassed." Seyss-Inquart's brutality was not limited to the Jewish population. He ruthlessly suppressed any form of resistance, authorizing the execution of thousands of Dutch citizens. One particularly grim example was the reprisal killings in the village of Putten in October 1944, where 552 men were deported to concentration camps in retaliation for a Dutch resistance attack on a German vehicle. Only 49 of these men would survive the war. The Putten raid became emblematic of the Nazi occupation's cruelty, with survivors like Janus Priem later recalling, "It was as if the entire village had died in one day." The Reich Commissioner's reign of terror extended to all aspects of Dutch life. He implemented the Arbeitseinsatz, a forced labor program that saw over 500,000 Dutch men sent to work in German factories. Those who resisted, like the students who refused to sign a declaration of loyalty to the Reich in 1943, faced dire consequences. Many were sent to concentration camps, including the infamous Neuengamme, where thousands of Dutch prisoners perished. As the tide of war turned against Nazi Germany, Seyss-Inquart's policies became increasingly desperate and cruel. The winter of 1944, known as the Hongerwinter, Hunger Winter, saw widespread famine in the western Netherlands as a result of a German embargo on food transports. An estimated 22,000 Dutch citizens died of starvation during this period, a tragedy for which Seyss-Inquart was held directly responsible. Survivors like Audrey Hepburn, then a teenager in Arnhem, later spoke of eating tulip bulbs to survive, a haunting testament to the desperation of those months. Even as Allied forces closed in, Seyss-Inquart refused to relent. In April 1945, he issued orders to flood large parts of the Netherlands by destroying dikes, an act of spite that would have caused widespread devastation had it been fully carried out. It was only the rapid advance of Canadian forces, spearheaded by General Charles Foulkes, that prevented this final act of destruction. In a bitter irony, Seyss-Inquart's last official act as Reich Commissioner was to sign the surrender document to General Foulkes on May 5, 1945, at the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen, formally ending the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Captured by Canadian troops on May 7, 1945, near Hamburg, Seyss-Inquart soon found himself facing justice at the Nuremberg trials. The testimonies against him were damning. Dutch resistance fighter Johannes Hendrik Scheps recounted the terror of life under Seyss-Inquart's rule, describing how every day brought new horrors, new pains, new terrors. Polish survivors spoke of his complicity in the atrocities committed in their homeland, with one witness, Josef Bühler, testifying to Seyss-Inquart's knowledge of the extermination camps. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Seyss-Inquart offered a weak defense, claiming he had tried to mitigate the harshest Nazi policies. This argument found little sympathy with the tribunal. On October 1, 1946, he was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The chief U.S. prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, in his closing statement, powerfully articulated the case against Seyss-Inquart and his co-defendants. "If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, there are no slain, there has been no crime." In his final statement before the court, Seyss-Inquart expressed remorse for the atrocities committed under Nazi rule, saying, "I hope that this evil and terrible time will be overcome and that true peace will come to the world." However, many viewed this last-minute contrition as a cynical attempt to escape the gallows. Dutch journalist Louis de Jong, who covered the trial, wrote, "His words rang hollow in the ears of those who had suffered under his rule." On the night of October 15, 1946, Seyss-Inquart faced his final judgment. As he was led to the gallows, he reportedly remained calm, even exchanging a few words with the American guards. His last words were, "I hope that this execution is the last act of tragedy of the Second World War, and that the lesson taken from this World War will be that peace and understanding should exist between peoples. I believe in Germany." At 2:45 a.m. on October 16, 1946, Arthur Seyss-Inquart was hanged, the last of the 10 Nazi war criminals executed following the Nuremberg trials. His death was met with a sense of grim satisfaction in the Netherlands, where the wounds of his brutal occupation were still fresh. Yet for many of his victims, no punishment could ever truly atone for the suffering he had inflicted. The Poison Pen's Last Dance, Julius Streicher and the Price of Hatred. In the grim theatre of the Nuremberg trials, where the architects of Nazi Germany's atrocities faced justice, one figure stood out for his grotesque legacy of hate and his bizarrely defiant final act. Julius Streicher would meet his end not for commanding armies or orchestrating mass murders, but for wielding words as weapons in a crusade of bigotry that helped pave the way for genocide. As American journalist William L. Shirer, who covered the rise of Nazi Germany, wrote in his seminal work, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, "If the Third Reich had had a court jester, it would have been Julius Streicher." Born on February 12, 1885, in Fleinhausen, Bavaria, Streicher's journey to infamy began long before the rise of Nazi Germany. A schoolteacher by profession, he found his true calling in the virulent anti-Semitism that festered in post-World War I Germany. His early career as an educator in Nuremberg, where he taught at the Volksschule, would later take on a sinister irony as he educated an entire nation in the ways of hatred. In 1923, Streicher founded Der Stürmer, a weekly newspaper that would become the mouthpiece for the most extreme and vicious anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazi era. The first issue, published on April 20th, 1923, Adolf Hitler's birthday, set the tone for the venom that would follow. Der Stürmer, with its lurid illustrations and sensationalist headlines, was a masterclass in the art of dehumanization. Its pages were filled with grotesque caricatures of Jews, portraying them as subhuman parasites bent on world domination and the corruption of Aryan purity. The newspaper's motto, borrowed from historian Heinrich von Treitschke, was a clarion call to hatred that echoed through German society. Streicher's influence grew as the Nazi Party rose to power. By 1933, Der Stürmer had a circulation of about 25,000. By 1935, in the wake of the Nuremberg laws that institutionalized anti-Semitism in Germany, its readership had swollen to 2 million. Streicher's venomous rhetoric found an eager audience, with special display cases for the newspaper erected in town squares across Germany. These Stürmerkasten became focal points for public anti-Semitism, with crowds often gathering to read the latest issues. In Munich alone, there were 50 such display cases by 1927. One of Streicher's most insidious contributions to Nazi propaganda was a children's book titled Der Giftpilz, The Poisonous Mushroom, published in 1938. The book taught children to view Jews as dangerous, subhuman creatures, much like poisonous mushrooms in a forest. It was a chilling example of how deeply the roots of hatred were being planted in German society. The book's illustrator, Philipp Ruprecht, known by the pen name Phipps, would later be sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in creating these hateful images. As the Nazi regime's crimes escalated, Streicher's propaganda provided a twisted justification for the unfolding Holocaust. In a 1939 article, he wrote, "A punitive expedition must come against the Jews in Russia, a punitive expedition which will provide the same fate for them that every murderer and criminal must expect. Death sentence and execution. The Jews in Russia must be killed. They must be exterminated root and branch." This call for genocide was not an isolated incident. In a May 1, 1939 issue, Streicher proclaimed, "The Jews are out to destroy all Germans. They want to contaminate our blood. There are two ways to deal with this threat. Either we destroy them, or they will destroy us. When the time came for reckoning at Nuremberg, Streicher found himself in a unique position among the defendants. Unlike many of his co-defendants, he had not held a significant government or military post during the war. His crime was not one of direct action, but of incitement, of poisoning minds and stoking the fires of hatred that fueled the Nazi killing machine. This fact was not lost on his fellow defendants. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments, wrote in his diary during the trial, "Streicher is the most repulsive of all the accused, a poisoner of young minds." The trial of Julius Streicher raised profound questions about the nature of complicity in mass atrocity. Can words alone constitute a war crime? The prosecution argued that Streicher's relentless campaign of anti-Semitic propaganda had been instrumental in creating the conditions that made the Holocaust possible. U.S. prosecutor Colonel Robert G. Story declared, "Streicher's incitement to murder and extermination at the time when Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes as defined by the Charter and constitutes a crime against humanity." This argument was bolstered by evidence of Streicher's direct knowledge of the extermination camps. Streicher's behavior during the trial was as outrageous as his publications had been. He disrupted proceedings with outbursts of anti-Semitic rhetoric, gave Nazi salutes, and attempted to turn the courtroom into a platform for his hateful ideology. At one point, he shouted at the judges, "The Talmud says that if a Jew is involved with a Gentile woman, she should be killed. The Jews are the master race." His antics led to him being temporarily removed from the courtroom on several occasions. On December 17, 1945, after one particularly vicious tirade, presiding Judge Jeffrey Lawrence ordered Streicher to be silent, stating, "The tribunal will not hear another word from you in these proceedings. You will be silent." Despite his antics, or perhaps because of them, Streicher's guilt became increasingly apparent as the trial progressed. Testimonies from his victims and examples of his writings painted a damning picture of a man whose life's work had been the demonization of an entire people. One particularly poignant moment came when a Jewish survivor, Konrad Morgan, testified about the impact of Streicher's propaganda on his community in Frankfurt. Morgan stated, "Streicher's words were like a death sentence for us. After each new issue of Der Stürmer, we could feel the hatred growing around us." On October 1, 1946, the verdict was delivered. Julius Streicher was found guilty of crimes against humanity. The judgment stated, "Streicher's incitement to murder and extermination at the time when Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes, as defined by the Charter, and constitutes a crime against humanity." The court's decision set a crucial precedent in international law, establishing that propagandists could be held accountable for the consequences of their words. The night before his execution, Streicher remained unrepentant. He was heard shouting "Heil Hitler" in his cell and singing the Nazi anthem Deutschland über alles. As he was led to the gallows in the early hours of October 16, 1946, Streicher's final moments would prove as controversial as his life had been. The prison psychologist G.M. Gilbert, who had observed Streicher closely during the trial, wrote in his diary, "Streicher had been in a state of suppressed excitement all evening. His hatred had reached a feverish pitch." Ascending the scaffold, Streicher shouted, "Heil Hitler!" Then, as the hood was placed over his head, he cried out, "Purim Fest 1946, a reference to the Jewish holiday of Purim, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jewish people from a plot to destroy them in ancient Persia. It was a final, twisted attempt to cast himself as a martyr in his imagined Jewish conspiracy. This bizarre outburst was consistent with Streicher's long-standing obsession with Jewish traditions and texts, which he had often distorted in his anti-Semitic writings. As the trapdoor opened, Streicher's last words were, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day." The execution was botched, with Streicher struggling for several minutes before finally dying. US Army officer Henry Göring, who witnessed the hanging, later wrote, "Streicher went down struggling all the way." This gruesome end seemed a fitting coda to a life devoted to promoting suffering and hatred. The last laugh of the devil's second in command, Hermann Göring's final act of defiance. In the twilight hours of October 15, 1946, as the world held its breath for the culmination of the Nuremberg trials, a shocking twist unfolded within the walls of Nuremberg prison. Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, cheated the hangman's noose with a final act of rebellion that would forever cast a shadow over the proceedings. This dramatic end was a fitting coda to the life of a man who had once proclaimed, "I am the only one who knows what I want." Göring's journey to this fateful moment had been a descent from the heights of power to the depths of infamy. Born into a privileged family on January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria, he rose to become Hitler's right-hand man, the creator and commander of the fearsome Luftwaffe, and the architect of many of the Third Reich's most heinous policies. His fall from grace was as spectacular as his rise, culminating in his capture by American forces on May 7, 1945, in Bavaria. When he surrendered to Brigadier General Robert Stack of the US 7th Army, Göring reportedly said, "I'm glad you will be the one to take me into custody. I'm no longer head of the Luftwaffe. I am just a poor man." As the Nuremberg trials commenced on November 20, 1945, Göring emerged as the most prominent defendant among the 22 Nazi leaders in the dock. His performance in the courtroom was a bizarre mix of defiance, charm, and cunning that often left prosecutors flummoxed. US Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson found himself particularly frustrated by Göring's ability to dodge questions and manipulate the proceedings. In one memorable exchange, Göring quipped, "The victor will always be the judge, and the vanquished the accused." This sardonic observation encapsulated Göring's view of the trials as mere victor's justice. Throughout the trial, Göring maintained his larger-than-life persona. He had lost a significant amount of weight during his imprisonment, shedding his once rotund figure along with nearly 70 pounds. This physical transformation seemed to sharpen his wit, and he often dominated the courtroom with his verbose responses and sardonic humor. On one occasion, when asked about his role in the Reichstag fire of 1933, Göring retorted, "The only one who really knows about the Reichstag is I, because I set it on fire," a statement he later claimed was sarcastic. Fellow defendant Albert Speer later wrote, "Göring's brilliant defense of himself and his disarming frankness about his own role momentarily obscured the fact that this was the man most responsible, next to Hitler, for the misery in which Germany now found itself." As the trial progressed, however, the weight of evidence against Göring became overwhelming. His role in the plunder of occupied territories, the murder of captured Allied airmen, and the implementation of the final solution was laid bare. The prosecution presented damning documents, including the infamous Göring Order of July 31, 1941, which instructed Reinhard Heydrich to prepare a plan for the final solution of the Jewish question. On October 1, 1946, the verdict was delivered. Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to wage war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging, alongside 11 of his co-defendants. In the days following the verdict, Göring's demeanor changed. He requested a military execution by firing squad, arguing that as a soldier, he deserved a soldier's death. In a letter to the Allied Control Council, he wrote, "I request that I be permitted to die like a soldier and that I be shot by a firing squad." When this was denied, he seemed to accept his fate with a grim resignation, or so it appeared. Behind this facade, Göring was plotting his final act of defiance. On the night of October 15th, just hours before his scheduled execution, Göring pulled off his final, audacious act. Somehow, He had obtained a cyanide capsule and swallowed it in his cell, dying at 10:45 p.m. The discovery of his body sent shockwaves through the prison and beyond. Colonel B.C. Andrus, the commandant of the Nuremberg prison, found Göring's body and later recalled, "His face was suffused with blood and his chin was horribly discolored." How had the most closely watched prisoner in the world managed to cheat justice at the 11th hour? The mystery of Göring's fatal capsule has never been fully resolved. Theories abound, from a sympathetic American guard slipping him the poison to Göring having kept it hidden in a hollowed-out tooth or body cavity throughout his imprisonment. Some even speculated that his wife, Emmy, had passed him the capsule during their last meeting on September 28th, possibly concealed in a jar of face cream. In her memoirs, Emmy Göring wrote, "I had no idea he had poison. Had I known, I would have thrown myself at him and begged him not to take his life." Lieutenant Jack G. Wheelis, an American guard who had developed a friendly relationship with Göring, came under particular scrutiny. Wheelis had been seen entering Göring's cell on the day of his death, and Göring had gifted him his gold watch and cigarette case. While Wheelis always denied any involvement, suspicion lingered. Years later, Herbert Lee Stivers, a former American soldier on duty at Nuremberg, claimed he had unwittingly smuggled the cyanide to Göring, hidden in a fountain pen. However, this claim has been disputed by historians. The impact of Göring's death on the Nuremberg legacy was profound. For some, it was seen as a final act of defiance, a way for Göring to maintain control over his own destiny and deny the Allies their full measure of justice. Others viewed it as a humiliating security failure that tarnished the otherwise meticulous proceedings. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief U.S. prosecutor, lamented, "I always wanted Göring to be hanged. The hanging would have discredited him, but his death did not." Telford Taylor, who would go on to become the chief counsel for the prosecution in subsequent Nuremberg trials, later wrote, "Göring's death was a deeply troubling event. It denied the law its proper conclusion and allowed him to escape the dishonor of the gallows." This sentiment was echoed by many who felt that Göring had, in his final moments, undermined the solemnity and purpose of the trials. The public and media reaction to Göring's death was a mix of outrage, fascination, and dark humor. The New York Times headline on October 16, 1946, blared, "Göring cheats hangman, takes poison." British tabloids were even more sensational, with one declaring, "Nazi fat man's last laugh." The Daily Express in London ran with the headline, "Göring kills himself," accompanied by a large photo of the once corpulent Nazi leader. In Germany, the reaction was more complex. For some Germans still clinging to the remnants of Nazi ideology, Göring's death was viewed by some as a heroic act. For others, it was a reminder of the regime's cowardice in the face of defeat. The German newspaper Die Neue Zeitung wrote, "Göring's last act was entirely in character, a gesture of contempt for the court that had condemned him and for the Allied powers that had defeated Nazi Germany." Thomas Mann, the exiled German novelist and Nobel laureate, commented, "He was consistent to the end, this Hermann Göring, consistent in his theatrical posing, consistent in his cynicism." Göring's body was cremated and the ashes were scattered in the Konwentsbach, a tributary of the Isar River, to prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. In the years that followed, Göring's death became a subject of endless fascination and debate. It added a layer of intrigue to the already complex legacy of the Nuremberg trials, raising questions about justice, security, and the nature of accountability for crimes of such magnitude. The incident inspired numerous books, documentaries, and even works of fiction such as the 1948 novel The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, which imagined an alternate history where Göring succeeded Hitler. The gallows of judgment, when justice hung the architects of evil. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, a somber and chilling spectacle unfolded in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. The world held its breath as the culmination of the most significant trial of the 20th century approached its grim finale. The Nuremberg trials, which had begun on November 20th, 1945, were about to render their ultimate verdict on the surviving leadership of Nazi Germany. As the clock struck midnight, the prison's Lutheran chaplain, Henry Göring, made his final rounds, offering spiritual comfort to men who had once commanded armies and nations, but now faced their last moments on earth. The trials themselves were unprecedented in scope and ambition. For the first time in history, an international tribunal sought to hold individuals accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and the newly defined concept of crimes against humanity. The stage was set in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, a city chosen both for its symbolic value as the spiritual capital of Nazi rallies and for its largely intact courthouse. The selection of Nuremberg was not without irony. It was here that the infamous Nuremberg laws of 1935, stripping Jews of their citizenship and prohibiting their marriage to non-Jews, had been proclaimed. Now, the very men who had crafted those laws would face judgment in the same city. As dawn broke on that fateful October day, 10 men stood on the precipice of eternity, their fates sealed by the weight of their actions during the darkest chapter of modern history. These were not mere foot soldiers or minor bureaucrats, but the very architects of the Third Reich's machinery of death and destruction. The absence of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, all of whom had taken their own lives in the war's final days, only heightened the symbolic importance of these executions. Among them was Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's silver-tongued foreign minister, whose diplomatic machinations had paved the way for German aggression across Europe. Ribbentrop, once the champagne salesman who rose to become the Reich's chief diplomat, had played a crucial role in negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which temporarily allied Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union and set the stage for the invasion of Poland. Wilhelm Keitel, the obsequious field marshal who had rubber-stamped orders for the execution of commandos and the deportation of Jews, awaited his turn. Keitel, nicknamed La Keitel, Lackey, by his fellow officers for his sycophantic devotion to Hitler, had signed the instrument of surrender on May 7, 1945, in Reims, France. Now he faced his own unconditional end. Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht, whose signature graced the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, now faced his own unconditional end. Jodl had been present at the Wolfschanze on July 20, 1944, when Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb failed to kill Hitler. His loyalty then had saved him. Now it condemned him. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, whose brutal reign had turned that country into a slaughterhouse, would soon meet the same fate as countless victims of his regime. Frank, once a successful lawyer who had briefly represented Hitler, had overseen the murder of millions in the general government of occupied Poland. In a moment of apparent remorse during his trial, he had stated, "1,000 years will pass, and still Germany's guilt will not have been erased." Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the towering chief of the Reich Main Security Office, bore the responsibility for the operations of the Gestapo and the implementation of the final solution. Kaltenbrunner, with his imposing 6-7 inches frame and scarred face, had risen through the ranks of the SS to become one of Heinrich Himmler's most trusted lieutenants. Wilhelm Frick, the bureaucratic mastermind behind the Nuremberg race laws, stood alongside Alfred Rosenberg, the party ideologue whose pseudo-philosophical ramblings had provided a veneer of intellectualism to Nazi racial theories. Frick, as Minister of the Interior, had been instrumental in the legal framework that stripped Jews of their rights. Rosenberg, author of The Myth of the 20th Century, had provided the ideological underpinnings for Nazi anti-Semitism and the concept of Lebensraum. Rounding out this rogues gallery were Fritz Sauckel, the Reich's plenipotentiary for labor deployment who had orchestrated the slave labor program, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Austrian Nazi who had facilitated the Anschluss and later served as Reichskommissar for the occupied Netherlands. Sauckel had been responsible for the deportation of millions of workers to Germany, while Seyss-Inquart's rule in the Netherlands had been marked by brutal repression and the deportation of over 100,000 Dutch Jews to concentration camps. The execution process was meticulously planned, a far cry from the arbitrary brutality these men had overseen. Master Sergeant John C. Woods, assisted by Joseph Malta, had been tasked with carrying out the sentences. Woods, an experienced army hangman, had overseen 34 executions during World War II. However, his competence would later be questioned, with reports suggesting that some of the condemned suffered slow strangulation, rather than the quick death of a broken neck. The gymnasium had been converted into an execution chamber, with 3 black-painted wooden gallows erected at one end. A black curtain separated this grim theatre from the witness area. The condemned were to be brought in one by one, their identities confirmed, hands bound, and a hood placed over their heads before the noose was adjusted. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of history and the impending acts of retribution. At 1:11 a.m., Joachim von Ribbentrop became the first to mount the scaffold. His last words, "God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My final wish is that Germany should recover her unity, and that for the sake of peace, there should be understanding between East and West. I wish peace to the world," echoed in the hushed gymnasium before the trap door opened beneath his feet. The man who had once clinked champagne glasses with Stalin's emissaries now dangled lifelessly, a stark symbol of the fall of the Third Reich. The executions proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Wilhelm Keitel followed at 1:44 a.m., declaring, "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." Keitel's final words reflected the militaristic devotion that had defined his career and ultimately led to his downfall. The executions continued through the night, with Alfred Jodl being the last to face the gallows at 2:34 a.m. In less than 2 hours, 10 of the most powerful men in the Third Reich had been reduced to lifeless bodies, swinging from ropes. The swift and clinical nature of the executions stood in stark contrast to the years of suffering and death these men had inflicted upon millions. The controversial nature of these executions was not lost on observers. Some saw them as the ultimate expression of justice, a fitting end for men who had orchestrated unimaginable horrors. Others, however, viewed them as little more than victor's justice, a sentiment reflected in Hermann Göring's earlier farewell note. "The Allies have kept us for 1¼ years under indictment and observation, robbed us of our honor, and treated us as if we were the lowest of the low." Indeed, the comparison to other post-war punishments was stark. While these men faced the gallows, many lower-ranking Nazis were already being rehabilitated and reintegrated into German society. The Cold War was beginning to reshape geopolitics, and pragmatism was starting to outweigh the desire for comprehensive justice. Operation Paperclip, for instance, saw the United States recruiting German scientists like Werner von Braun, despite their Nazi pasts, in the interest of gaining an edge in the space race against the Soviet Union. The aftermath of the executions was handled with clinical precision. The bodies were photographed and fingerprinted to prevent any doubt about their identities. US Army photographer Edward F. McLaughlin captured the grim images, which remained classified for decades. Then, in a final act designed to deny these men any posthumous cult of personality, their remains were cremated at Ostfriedhof, Munich's Eastern Cemetery. On October 17, 1946, the ashes of these once powerful Nazi leaders were scattered in the Konwentsbach, a tributary of the Isar River. This inglorious end was a far cry from the pomp and circumstance these men had once commanded, a stark reminder of the ephemeral nature of tyrannical power. The decision to dispose of the ashes in this manner was inspired by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who had suggested it to prevent the creation of Nazi shrines. As news of the executions spread, reactions varied widely. For many, it represented closure, a symbolic end to the horror of Nazi rule. For others, particularly in Germany, it was a moment of complex emotions, shame, relief, and a desire to move forward. The German newspaper Die Neue Zeitung reported the executions under the headline, Nazi leaders hanged. The banality of evil, Adolf Eichmann's final judgment. In the annals of human history, few names evoke the same level of revulsion and horror as Adolf Eichmann, the man who became known as the architect of the Holocaust. Eichmann's journey from a seemingly ordinary bureaucrat to one of the most notorious war criminals of the 20th century is a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity and the dangers of blind obedience. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt famously observed, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. Born on March 19, 1906, in Solingen, Germany, Eichmann's early life gave little indication of the monstrous role he would play in world history. He struggled academically and professionally, working as a traveling salesman for an oil company before finding his calling in the Nazi Party. It was on April 1, 1932, that he joined the party, setting in motion a series of events that would lead to his central role in one of humanity's darkest chapters. His rapid rise through the ranks of the SS, Schutzstaffel, was a testament to his organizational skills and ideological fervor. As the head of the Reich Security Main Office's Department for Jewish Affairs, Eichmann became the logistical mastermind behind the final solution, the Nazi plan for the systematic extermination of European Jews. His role was crystallized at the infamous Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, where he took the minutes as high-ranking Nazi officials discussed the implementation of the Holocaust. The conference, held in a picturesque villa on the shores of Berlin's Wannsee Lake, lasted just 90 minutes, but sealed the fate of millions. With cold efficiency, Eichmann coordinated the transportation of millions to their deaths. His meticulous planning ensured that trains ran on time, delivering their human cargo to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other death camps. In a chilling demonstration of his dedication to this grim task, Eichmann once declared, "I will leap into my grave laughing, because the feeling that I have 5 million human beings on my conscience is for me a source of extraordinary satisfaction." This statement, made to his subordinates in 1945, reveals the depths of his commitment to the Nazi cause. Eichmann's efficiency was such that he even continued to arrange deportations of Jews to the camps in the final days of the war, long after Heinrich Himmler had ordered a halt to the killings. In May 1944, for instance, Eichmann personally oversaw the deportation of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks. This operation was so swift and thorough that it shocked even hardened SS officers. As the tide of war turned against Nazi Germany, Eichmann, like many of his compatriots, attempted to flee justice. He escaped to Argentina in 1950, living under the alias Ricardo Clement. For a decade, he eluded capture, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory and living a modest life in the Buenos Aires suburb of San Fernando. But the long arm of justice was reaching out, propelled by the tireless efforts of Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and the determination of the young state of Israel. In a daring operation that reads like a spy thriller, Israel's Mossad tracked Eichmann to Buenos Aires. The breakthrough came when Lothar Hermann, a half-Jewish German immigrant to Argentina, became suspicious of his daughter's new boyfriend, Klaus Eichmann, who boasted about his father's Nazi past. Hermann passed this information to Fritz Bauer, a German prosecutor, who in turn alerted Israeli authorities. On May 11, 1960, a team of Mossad agents, led by the legendary Issa Harel, launched Operation Finale. As Eichmann stepped off a bus near his home on Garibaldi Street, he was swiftly ambushed and bundled into a waiting car. The team held him in a safe house for 9 days, subjecting him to intense interrogation to confirm his identity. In a moment of high drama, when asked to write his Nazi ID number, Eichmann reportedly complied, writing SS Obersturmbannführer 45326, sealing his fate. Smuggled out of Argentina disguised as an El Al crew member, Eichmann arrived in Israel on May 22, 1960. His capture and subsequent trial would become a watershed moment in Israel's history, and in the world's understanding of the Holocaust. The operation was not without controversy, as Argentina protested the violation of its sovereignty, leading to a UN Security Council crisis that was only resolved when Israel and Argentina issued a joint statement. The trial of Adolf Eichmann began on April 11, 1961, in Jerusalem's Beit Ha'am, a venue chosen for its size to accommodate the intense public interest. It was a spectacle unlike any seen before, broadcast internationally and attended by hundreds of journalists from around the world. For many, this was the first time they heard detailed accounts of the Holocaust from survivors themselves. The prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, opened the trial with words that would echo through history. "Standing with me here at this moment are 6 million prosecutors, but they cannot rise to level the finger of accusation. Their blood cries to heaven, but their voice cannot be heard." Throughout the trial, Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth, a symbol of both his notoriety and the determination to give him a fair trial despite the magnitude of his crimes. His demeanor was eerily calm, almost bureaucratic, as he listened to the horrific testimonies of Holocaust survivors. One particularly poignant moment came when Yehiel Denur, a survivor of Auschwitz, took the stand. Upon seeing Eichmann, Denur fainted, overcome by the memories of the horrors he had endured. Eichmann's defense strategy hinged on what would become infamously known as the Nuremberg defense, the claim that he was merely following orders. "I was just a small cog in the machine," he insisted, portraying himself as a dutiful civil servant rather than a willing architect of genocide. This defense was systematically dismantled by the prosecution, who presented evidence of Eichmann's zeal in carrying out his murderous tasks, often going beyond his orders in his efficiency. Hausner famously retorted, "The devil himself could not have done it better." The philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe Eichmann. She argued that great evils in history were not executed by fanatics or sociopaths, but rather by ordinary people who accepted the premises of their state and therefore participated in evil with the view that their actions were normal. This concept, while controversial, has profoundly influenced our understanding of how ordinary individuals can become complicit in extraordinary crimes. On December 15, 1961, the court found Eichmann guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death, the only civil execution ever carried out in Israel. In the early hours of June 1, 1962, Eichmann was led to the gallows at Ramla prison. His last words were reported to be, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the 3 countries with which I have been most connected and which I will not forget. I greet my wife, my family, and my friends. I am ready. We'll meet again soon, as is the fate of all men. I die believing in God." In a final act to prevent any posthumous glorification, Israeli authorities cremated Eichmann's body and scattered his ashes in the Mediterranean Sea beyond Israel's territorial waters. This deliberate act ensured that no grave or memorial could become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis or Holocaust deniers. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion explained the decision, saying, "We don't want Eichmann's followers to make a place of pilgrimage out of his grave." As we bid farewell to this chilling chapter, let us heed the words of Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter. For evil to flourish, it only requires good men to do nothing. The Nuremberg executions stand as a stark reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, has a long memory and an even longer reach. In the end, these men who once strode across Europe like colossi, their power seemingly limitless, were reduced to ashes scattered in an unnamed stream. Their legacy is not one of greatness, but a cautionary tale etched in the collective consciousness of humanity. And so, dear viewers, we leave behind the gallows of Nuremberg, but carry forward the torch of remembrance, illuminating the path towards a more just world. Until next time, may we never forget, and may we always strive to be on the right side of history.